Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 28 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the St. Louis Blues, in which the Sharks have lost 2-1 in the shootout. We haven't seen a shootout for a while for the San Jose Sharks. It felt as though we couldn't not see a shootout earlier on this season, and the Sharks were 4-1 in the skills competition, but they end up losing this one, unfortunately, maybe looking a bit rusty in that regard. And this was the first of a pivotal two-game series against the St. Louis Blues, and while the Sharks will be at least somewhat happy-ish with a single point from this game, it's only slightly better than the worst-case scenario of having lost in regulation, and the Sharks would have much preferred to be able to win in regulation themselves, taking the full 2 points and leaving the Blues with nothing. And this one started off with not too much action in the first period. Neither team would get too many great chances, and neither team would actually be able to score, and it would only come in the second period where the Sharks would actually get the first goal of this game. Right out of the penalty box, Ryan Donato would take the lead for the Sharks, and after 40 minutes, the Sharks would be in a somewhat familiar position as they had the lead, just as they did in the previous game against the Golden Knights, though of course against the Golden Knights it was a 2-goal lead, and here tonight it was only a 1-goal lead. But similar to how they did against the Golden Knights, the Sharks kind of fell apart a bit in that third period. While the first few minutes of it were not too bad, the Blues definitely turned it on after that. We're getting a lot of good chances, and eventually it turned on its head once again off of a power play, but this time it was a Sharks power play. The Sharks got this 2-minute opportunity, their first power play of the game, and it was completely disastrous. The Blues had the majority of the chances and would eventually score shorthanded off of the Tyler Bozak goal, which was quite lucky, but honestly the Sharks were kind of deserving to get scored on after the terrible power play that they just exhibited. And when it came to the overtime, after it went in 1-1, the Sharks had an opportunity to redeem themselves on a full 2-minute power play in said overtime 4-on-3, and it was just as disastrous, if not more so, and the only good chance on the power play was also still coming from the St. Louis Blues, and we would head to the shootout. In the shootout, the Blues would get 2 goals, one from Shen and one from Tarasenko, while the Sharks would only get one, that being from Logan Couture, and the Sharks would drop the extra point. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones. He comes back in the net for this one after a disappointing performance in the previous game from Devan Dubnyk, and of course, since this is a back-to-back, Jones was going to get this game, whether Dubnyk had been perfect in the previous game or not, and Dubnyk will basically guarantee get the following game tomorrow. Jones actually played quite well in this one, lets in the goal to Tyler Bozak, basically had zero chance on that one off of a very lucky bounce for the St. Louis Blues, but otherwise Jones made some pretty nice saves. There weren't a ton of great chances for the St. Louis Blues, but on the great chances that they did get, Jones was absolutely there. He had a beautiful glove save on one attempt where he was completely screened. It felt as though, I have no idea how he actually got his glove on this, but he did. Very nice save from Martin Jones, and that's now 2 straight games for him where he's played very well, and we'll see if he can beat Devan Dubnyk's very, very elusive record of 3 straight good games when Martin Jones next plays, which I assume will be, unless Devan Dubnyk gets like a shutout tomorrow, I assume will be the game after tomorrow, which is on Monday. Next, we'll be talking about Marcus Sorensen. He finally returns to the lineup here in place of Handemark. The reason he had been kept out for a pretty extended period of time is he was actually on the COVID protocol list, though I believe the rumor was that Sorensen didn't actually have COVID. It was a false positive, but then there was some sort of regulation with the state of California that made it so that he couldn't play anyway, or something of that nature where he couldn't actually be in the lineup for an extended period of time, even though there was nothing actually wrong with him. But in the end, he finally managed to get back into the top 12 here tonight, and he was actually pretty effective. Not a ton of fantastic chances or anything like that, and it's not like he was lighting the lamp or anything. However, I thought Sorensen showed a pretty good effort and a pretty solid game, all things considered, and considering Sorensen's season has been not so great, it's pretty good to see that out of him, and he actually got a look on the third line in this one, which I thought was pretty interesting and looked pretty decent on the line with Gambrell and Leonard, who also looked quite good themselves. Next, I'll be talking about Marc-Edouard Vlasic. So, as I've mentioned multiple times this season, a lot of the spotlight will shine in terms of defense onto Erik Karlsson, and then of course Brent Burns is there as well, and Vlasic, is probably going to be in a bit, outside of that spotlight for majority of the season, and rightfully so. Honestly, Vlasic has not had that great of a year at all. But here tonight, you got to give credit where credit is due. Marc-Edouard Vlasic, I thought, was pretty solid here for the San Jose Sharks. I had made the point in the previous game that there could have been a defensive pairing switch up, where maybe Nizov could move down, and then someone like Shemek could move up to the second pairing and have a Nizov-Vlasic third pairing. That didn't end up actually happening, but Vlasic Shemek looked very solid, and Vlasic in particular had a couple of very nice defensive plays in this game. So, as I said, you gotta highlight him when he plays well if you're going to, consistently trash talk him when he doesn't play that well. And finally, I'll talk about something that has not been so great for the Sharks this entire season, but was sort of, elevated in tonight's game, which was the face-offs for the San Jose Sharks. It was just disastrous here tonight, below 40%, and we saw the Sharks get burned on it a couple of times. A lot of the times when they're on the power play, it was just the St. Louis Blues consistently getting the opportunity right off the faceoff to just clear the puck out of the zone. In the overtime, most of the time, goalies like to keep the play going, so they'll usually just play it to their defender so they don't have to get a faceoff in the offensive zone, because if you lose that faceoff, you're not in a great position. But the Blues didn't really have to worry about that all that much, because they were more or less winning every other faceoff in this game, because the San Jose Sharks just couldn't really get anything going for themselves in that regard. And it's not just a this game issue, it's an entire season issue. The San Jose Sharks currently finding themselves, at least prior to this game, 26th in the league in faceoff percentage. In terms of their division, the only team that is slightly below them is the Minnesota Wild. So the Sharks not only find themselves 7th in the division, but 7th in place in the division for faceoff percentage as well. And I remember the pendulum has sort of swung on faceoffs. Back at the beginning of the decade, it felt as though faceoffs were a very, very important part of hockey. It felt like something that everybody talked about. Like, you couldn't be a number one center in the league if you didn't have a faceoff percentage above 50%. And if you wanted to be, let's say, a third line center in the league, if you didn't have like a 54 or 55% faceoff percentage, you might as well not even try at that point. And yet, in the past couple of years, it felt as though the pendulum has swung completely the other way, where faceoffs are almost entirely ignored, and most of the logic for players is sort of like, if we lose the faceoff, we'll just get the puck back. But the real importance of faceoff obviously lies somewhere in between them. It's not like the end-all be-all of hockey, but it's also not something that you can completely ignore. We've seen the Sharks get burned time and time again on the faceoffs. I mean, just in the previous game against the previous two games against the Vegas Golden Knights, I should say. That first one, it was a Max Pacioretty who scored. The Golden Knights had a power play. They win the faceoff. They get it straight to Pacioretty, and just 7 seconds in, the Golden Knights get the first goal of the game. And we saw it again in the next game after that. The Sharks are leading 3-1. They take a too many men on the ice penalty. The Golden Knights go on the power play, and immediately off the draw, basically, Cody Glass gets the goal to make it 3-2. If the Sharks manage to win those faceoffs, I'm not going to say that they end up winning those two games, but I will say that, things could have definitely played out at the very least slightly different. And so that's going to be something that the Sharks absolutely should work on. People look at the power play, people look at the penalty kill as these special teams that are so important, but the faceoffs obviously have a very underrated importance to them as well. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow as they'll take on the St. Louis Blues once again, their final game against the St. Louis Blues this season. And as I pointed out, these two games of huge importance for the San Jose Sharks' playoff chances, if you could even call them playoff chances at this point. If the Sharks can't at the very least get 2 points tomorrow, they might be able to kiss those playoff chances goodbye. Class dismissed.